Greetings, I'm Socratic Vet. Every idea's got a crack. Let's press on it and see if it breaks. Before we press on today's idea, let's slow down and notice something about the way people talk. Most ideas in public life aren't examined. They're repeated. They are inherited. They're treated as settled truths long before anyone asks the first question. And that's usually where I find the cracks. Not in the loud arguments, but in the quiet assumptions everyone thinks they already understand and that the opposition already understands. So today, instead of starting with a conclusion, we're going to start with a test. Not of people, not of motives, but of the idea itself. Because if an idea is solid, it will hold under pressure. And if it isn't, well, pressure will show us where it breaks. So let's take one of the most confidently repeated claims in modern discourse, a claim treated as morally obvious, socially unquestionable, and culturally settled. What is it? Cultural appropriation. And instead of reacting to it, let's examine it, not with outrage, not with slogans, but with questions. We are told cultural appropriation is a moral issue. A matter of respect, a matter of justice, a matter of protecting vulnerable cultures from being consumed by dominant ones. That's the claim. But before we accept it, let's ask a simple question. If this is truly a moral principle, then how should it behave when different groups utilize it? Because if the principle is real, it should apply consistently, universally, symmetrically, to the majority and the minority, to strong cultures and weak cultures. So let's test it. Let's go through what we often hear. When the majority borrows from minority, the language often comes across as severe: theft, erasure, colonization, violence. But when the minority culture borrows from the majority, the language seems to flip. It's now representation, visibility, empowerment, inclusion. Same action, different moral label. So here's the pressure. If the morality of an action changes depending on who performs it, is it still a moral principle, or is it simply wearing moral clothing? Because moral principles are universal, and this one seems selective. So we've already discovered that the rule doesn't seem to behave like a moral principle. So the next question is pretty simple. Then what does it behave like? To answer that, we have to stop looking at the language around the rule and start looking at the effects of the rule. How does it actually manifest in the world? Because intentions can be debated, obfuscated, downright lied about. Outcomes cannot. So let's examine what the rule actually does and when it's applied. When the majority is accused of appropriation, what follows? They are told to step back. They are told to surrender cultural space. They are told their participation is harmful. They are told their presence distorts meaning. Now let's examine the inverse. When the minority does it, they're praised for representation. They gain access to majority platforms. They gain cultural influence. They gain institutional legitimacy. They gain the ability to redefine the space as they enter it. So let's press on that. If one group is consistently told to retreat and the other is consistently encouraged to advance, what kind of rule produces that pattern? Because moral rules restrain everyone equally in the spirit of equality, respect. They limit what anyone can do. But this rule doesn't limit both sides. It limits one and empowers the other. So let's test it further. Does the rule ever ask the minority to take a step back? No. Does it ever ask them to surrender cultural space? No. Does it ever accuse them of distorting meanings? No. The rule only moves in one direction. So here's the rub. If a rule always shifts influence from one group to another, is it describing harm or is it reallocating authority? Because rules that redistribute authority aren't moral, they're structural. And rules that consistently elevate one group while diminishing another aren't ethical frameworks. They're something else entirely. So now we can finally ask the real question, the one we've been circling. If a rule always produces the same directional transfer of cultural power, is that the behavior of a moral principle or the behavior of a rhetorical tool used in politics? And now that we understand a rule's behavior, not as a moral principle, but as a mechanism that reallocates cultural authority, we can test it against a real cultural moment. A moment where millions watched the rule in action without ever naming it, most not even understanding it. A moment where the asymmetry didn't just exist, it became visible, visceral, even if people couldn't put words to it. And that moment was Bad Bunny's Super Bowl halftime show. The Super Bowl halftime show is not just entertainment, it's one of the last remaining mass audience rituals in American life now that the internet has taken over the mass media space. It's a shared cultural space for Americans within the United States. It's a national moment. Many describe it as the greatest holiday, even though it's not a national holiday. It might as well be. So let's start with a simple question. If a cultural space is uniquely American, what does it mean when that space is performed entirely in a language that most Americans do not speak? Now, Bad Bunny is an American in Puerto Rico. Yes. But is he representative of the overwhelming majority of American culture? No. No, he's not. Because if cultural appropriation is defined by power, right, then we should be able to apply the same logic here. Let's test if the rule says, using our symbols without understanding them is harmful. Then could the majority say the same? If the rule says, taking our cultural space and making it unfamiliar is erasure, then could the majority say the same thing? If benefiting from our platform while rejecting our norms is exploitation, could the majority say the same thing? But that's not how the reaction is unfolding. So we have to ask, why does the logic of appropriation suddenly stop working the moment the direction of influence reverses? Because if the principle were real, it would apply here too. Now, I'm not saying Bad Bunny shouldn't have represented his particular subculture within the American experience. Absolutely not. But the entire show, he's alienating an overwhelming majority of the population of the United States during one of their greatest cultural events. And if the concern were truly about understanding respect, cultural continuity, or preserving meaning, then the same questions would arise, but they don't. So let's press harder. If the majority performing in a minority style is stealing, why is the minority performing in a majority cultural space framed as representation, inclusion? If the rule were moral, the direction would not matter. But the direction matters a great deal. Look at the discourse. And that tells us something important. The halftime show doesn't break the rule. It doesn't break any rules. It exposes the rule, the tactic. Because the moment we apply the same standard in reverse, the entire framework collapses. And that collapse produced something predictable, a backlash. Not from everyone, not from the entire country, but specifically from Americans on the political right and center. So let's ask the question they were asking. If they didn't articulate it this way, even if they didn't articulate it this way, if this is supposed to be a shared national ritual, why does it feel like the ritual is being rewritten without the consent of the people who built it? The reaction wasn't just about language. It wasn't just about music. It wasn't even about Bad Bunny. It was about ownership. It's about identity, about who gets to define what American means on the biggest cultural stage in the country. And whether the people who have historically held that definition are now being told implicitly or explicitly that the culture they built no longer belongs to them. That is the crack the backlash illuminated. Not because the right invented it, but because the moment the rule was applied in reverse on this large of a scale, they were the ones who felt the shift. And once we see that shift, once we see who feels displaced, who feels empowered, and who feels rewritten, we can widen the lens. Because this isn't about a halftime show. That's noise. It's about a deeper contradiction in how the West is treated. talked about and used, a contradiction that becomes impossible to ignore once you see who is fighting to inherit the cultural spaces they claim to reject. Modern discourse often frames the West, and especially the United States, as morally bankrupt, historically oppressive, culturally destructive, and uniquely guilty among world powers. So let's ask the question that sits beneath all of this. If the West is so corrupt, why is its culture the most valuable real estate on earth? Why fight to headline the Super Bowl, dominate American entertainment, control American institutions, redefine American identity, claim American symbols, reshape American narratives that have been held for centuries? Why seek validation from the very civilization you claim is morally inferior? If America is the villain, why is everyone fighting to be the protagonist in its story? If Western culture is oppressive, why is access to it treated as liberation? If Western institutions are corrupt, why is control of them treated as justice? If Western identity is illegitimate, why is inheriting it treated as victory? So what does this tell us? If civilization is condemned rhetorically but coveted strategically, is the critique about morality or is it about inheritance? Because if you don't fight to inherit something you believe is worthless. You fight to inherit something you believe is powerful. And that's the contradiction the halftime show helps us reveal. Not because Bad Buddy intended it, I don't think he has the mental faculties. But because the reaction exposes it. Once we see the contradiction, the condemnation of the West paired with a desire to inherit it and conquer it, we recognize the pattern. Because this isn't the first time we've seen a rule that condemns Western power in theory but depends on it in practice. We've seen this before. I've talked about it. In episode 6, I pressed on the Monroe Doctrine as a political rule that is argued on a moral principle. So let's revisit that logic real quick. Western intervention is evil, but Western intervention is necessary when we want it. Condemn the West, depend on the West, resent the West, rely on the West. Now compare it to the cultural version. Western culture is oppressive, but Western cultural spaces are the most important ones to control. Reject the West rhetorically, but seek the West strategically. So what do we learn? When the same asymmetry appears in foreign policy and in culture, the issue isn't the domain, it's the pattern. And the patterns reveal motives. Because in both cases, the rules aren't moral. They are political. And political rules always reveal the same thing. The goal is not justice. The goal is inheritance. They don't want you to have a fair shot. They want the power and authority that the system provides. Because once we know the goal is inheritance, not morality, not consistency, not principle, we can finally ask the question that sits beneath this entire episode. So I'm going to ask it plainly. If the West is condemned yet coveted, if its power is rejected yet relied upon, if its culture is denounced yet desired, then what exactly is being critiqued? Is it the morality of the West? Or is it the fact that someone wants its position? When the rule only applies in one direction, it's not principle, it's strategy. And strategies reveal what people want, not what they believe in. We pressed on a pretty big crack today. It didn't break, but it got pretty wide. It looks almost like a cavern now. And there's always more to learn. Socratic Vet, out.